Good to be here. Yeah, no, I'm excited. I'm going to ask you hard questions.
That's mine.
Okay, let me trade.
Thank you.
There you go. And that's on mute there.
Oh, you can sit here and then come around. Yeah.
Just mute it quick for you.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna mute it, and then all you have to do is do that.
Hello. Okay. Hello, everybody. It's not. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So, yeah, it might sound kind of like faded over here. My name's Elisa. I'm on the events team here at Politics and Prose Bookstore, where we now host in-person and virtual events, along with partnered events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything confirmed, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as to not disrupt the event. Just a reminder, when we get time to open the floor to your questions, we've placed a mic right here by this column to your left. So please line up at one of these mics so that everyone can hear your question, as we want that question to be heard in our recording of the event. We are both audio and video recording today's program so that you or anyone you know can soon find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this big table. So if you haven't already purchased the book, we have plenty of copies behind our registers up at the front of the store. We'll ask you to line up starting here at the pillar, and we'll come by to ask for your name for personalizations. So please have your books ready for us. Once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So now, without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome Chris Fabricant, celebrating the release of Junk Science and the American Criminal Justice System. Chris Fabricant is, yeah. Chris Fabricant is the Innocence Project's Director of Strategic Litigation and one of the nation's leading experts on forensic sciences and the criminal justice system. Fabricant is featured in the Netflix documentary The Innocence Files, and his public commentary has been published in virtually every major media outlet. A former public defender and clinical law professor, Fabricant brings to his writing over 2 decades of experience ranging from litigating death penalty cases in the Deep South to misdemeanors in the South Bronx. Fabricant will be joined in conversation with Spencer Sue, an investigative reporter, 2-time Pulitzer finalist, and National Emmy Award nominee. Sue has covered Homeland Security, immigration, Virginia politics, and Congress. He received the Sigma Delta Chi Award and Ursula and Gilbert Farfel Prize for Excellence in Investigative Journalism in 2012. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose Chris Fabricant and Spencer Sue.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out. I'm really honored to be at Politics and Prose, where so many of my heroes have given readings before. So pinch me that I'm here, and I'm delighted that Spencer has joined me. The reading that I'm going to do is very short. It's about meeting my first Innocence Project client after starting there in 2012. And I picked it out because I think that judging a book by its cover, to coin a phrase, that you might think that it's more of a dry text or more science-y than it is. It's really much more of a personal book than, or, you know, not all personal, but lots of personal. Interstate 45 originates in the southeast corner of Texas near the Killing Fields, a 25-acre patch of dirt outside of League City where the bodies of at least 30 victims, nearly all young women thought to have been murdered by multiple serial killers, have been found since the 1970s. The highway runs a straight line north from League City through Houston before petering out in Dallas. The featureless terrain is so flat I could almost see Huntsville 65 miles away from my rental car as I headed north out of the Houston airport. An hour later, I passed a 70-foot-tall statue of Sam Houston on the outskirts of Huntsville. A white school bus with wrought iron mesh covering darkened windows passed in the southbound lane. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice's sky blue seal stamped on its side. Prisoners on the chain, handcuffed to each other for grinding cross-state bus rides on steel benches, heading from one cage to another, 58,000 prisoners endure roughly 22,000 trips or bus therapy across Texas every year, covering close to 5 million miles. Forgotten people going to hidden places. I pulled into the visitor's parking lot and stuck the file on the passenger seat into my shoulder bag. The inch-thick stack of paper represented everything I knew about Cheney's case. There were some pages of transcripts, Jim Hale's and Homer Campbell's testimony, a copy of the appellate opinion, crime scene photos of the Sweeks' mutilated bodies, and dozens of photos of the U-shaped injury on John Sweeks' forearm. Julie Lesser met me under the 3-story red brick guard tower at the front gate. Razor-wired gates parted, and we walked along a sidewalk cutting through a neatly trimmed lawn to the main entrance. At the guardhouse, a correction officer scrutinized my New York State bar card before allowing me to sign in for a legal visit. Heavy steel doors slid closed behind us with a 1,000-year thud as Lesser and I walked the gray corridor toward a row of cubicles partitioned down the middle by thick plexiglass. Black phones were mounted on the right-hand sides of the walls. There, in the center booth, sat my first Innocence Project client. He'd been waiting a long time. During my time as a public defender in the South Bronx, I spent a lot of time visiting clients on Rikers Island, New York City's infamous jail island complex in the East River. My clients were mostly young men bursting with rage, fear, desperation, and yes, hope. In my earlier work as an appellate defender, my clients had already been convicted at trial and were just beginning to serve lengthy prison sentences, slowly emptied of hot emotions, nurturing hope for freedom in prison law libraries in upstate New York. Most of my clients, those thrumming with pent-up energy on Rikers and those warehoused in century-old upstate prisons, were deeply skeptical of public defenders. Trust was earned only through showing respect and fighting hard. Usually I lost. Often I would not see or hear from my clients again after a conviction. There was always another more immediate crisis, another trial, another appeal, another arraignment shift. The wheel never stopped turning. There were thousands of individual people I had represented, sometimes for a few minutes at arraignments, sometimes for a few years. But I had never visited anyone 25 years into a life sentence. My file also held Stephen Cheney's arrest photo, a color Polaroid from the day Detective Westfalen pulled him off the construction site in Las Colinas. Deeply tanned from laboring under the Texas sun, Cheney wore a dusty white t-shirt that hugged his wiry frame. His chin pointed at the camera defiantly, exposing a prominent Adam's apple. His robust head of dirty blonde hair framed intense blue eyes. The coiled energy radiating from the photo is pure Rikers Island. And that was not the man sitting on the opposite side of the grimy plexiglass. Cheney had been drained of color. His hair and his eyes had gone iron gray. Deep lines ran like rivers across his pale forehead and down the sides of his mouth. His dull white prison scrubs made him nearly invisible. Only the black, prison-issued, Bloody Holly-style glasses stood out. I sat down on the steel stool in front of Cheney and picked up the phone. As he lifted his phone, Cheney bowed his head, seemingly collecting himself. When he looked back up, tears were streaming from his eyes and rushing through the lines the wind unit had carved into his face. "See," Lester said to Cheney, "I told you he would come." None of the years I had spent as a public defender prepared me for this. I'd never walked into a client interview and been treated like a savior, like I was wearing a cape. For the deeply religious Cheney, Julie Lesser was the vehicle Jesus had sent him, and our meeting in Huntsville was further evidence of the greatness of God. Cheney had spent the last decade watching Innocence Project lawyers free his fellow prisoners. Here was his own. In that moment, I felt an awesome responsibility. Cheney had been a test case for me until then, an ideal vehicle for challenging the junk science writ, or for using the junk science writ to challenge the status quo. I did not think about whether he was guilty or innocent. It was simply a perfect case. But now I had a client who believed I could make prison doors open with the wave of a wand. It was terrifying. There was little I could tell Cheney about bite mark evidence that he didn't already know. At his elbow was a battered copy of Scientific Evidence, a comprehensive treatise on forensics edited by some of the most respected science and law scholars in the country. Cheney knew it better than I did. He knew about footwear evidence, presumptive blood tests, and polygraphs, the throw-in junk science that had been used against him. Cheney knew subtle lies and liars. He knew waiting in line. But unlike me, he knew he was innocent. And unlike me, he had faith. I tried to temper expectations. There were a lot of bad facts and no more DNA to test, but Cheney never stopped smiling during the hour or so we spent together. He knew our meeting was a manifestation of his faith. God bless you, Mr. Fabricant. I wasn't sure what to say. We pressed our hands together through the glass, and I flew back to New York.
So it's my honor to be here and join with Chris. As you can here we have we're fortunate here because truth is stranger than fiction and reality is complicated. And one of the many great accomplishments of this book is not only is it beautifully written, but it honors that complexity with fact upon fact, case upon case. And it gives you a depth of a portrait of what, are some of the most extreme and gross failures of question forensic techniques. And it tells a story that covers 5 decades. So part 1 begins Virginia v. Keith Allen Harward and the rise of junk science. Tell us more.
Well, is this on? Now? Yeah. I began with Keith Allen Harward's case really because it's a textbook DNA exoneration, and it covers 50 years because all of these crimes were committed by somebody else than my clients, but they'd been committed during an era that predated DNA evidence. And the 3 cases that I use in the book are 3 different types of, kind of traditional wrongful convictions. One is Keith Allen Harward's, which has been a grotesque murder that had been committed in Newport News, Virginia. To give you a little bit of flavor of it is that a married couple was home in bed, asleep, and somebody in a Navy uniform broke into their house and murdered the husband in the marital bed and sexually tortured the wife for hours while her 3 children were asleep down the hall. They had no evidence, they had no suspects, they had no eyewitnesses, they had no real forensic evidence, and months went by without identifying a suspect, but they knew that the person had been a sailor because he was in a sailor. They believed that he was a sailor because he was in a sailor's uniform. And what happened was, and this is one of the reasons that I asked Spencer to join me, is that the role that the media sometimes plays in both wrongful convictions and in hyping forensics. And what had just happened right before the Keith Allen Harward trial was the Ted Bundy case. And the Ted Bundy case really brought bite mark evidence into the mainstream. And it was the first nationally televised criminal trial that we'd had in this country. The whole world watched, and the dentists were the stars of that show. And so that type of evidence was in the popular culture as a result. And the only thing that they really had to go on in Keith Allen Harward's case were bite marks that had been left on the victim's thighs. And so what they did is they took 3,000 sailors that were stationed at the Newport News and working on the USS Carl Vinson and did a dental dragnet. And they took the dental molds of all of these sailors and tried to match them up to the bite marks on Teresa's thighs to think that if we have a match, then we'll find the perpetrator. And so Mr. Harward was actually included in that original dragnet and then was excluded as a potential biter. But then what happened is that he got into a drunken argument with his girlfriend. She hit him with a frying pan. He bit her on the shoulder, and suddenly he became a biter. And then he became a suspect. And then 6 dentists decided that it was him and only him that could have made those bite marks. And that was the only evidence that was used really to convict him. And he was almost sentenced to death. And that the only reason that he had survived was because his parents had gotten on the stand and begged for his life. And what was astonishing about that was that there was, just to go back to what his parents were talking about, they saved his life as a result of this. But when I finally met Keith Howard's brother, who had not seen him for 30 years, he talked about being in the trial and knowing his brother was innocent, not believing that it's possible that his brother could have committed this atrocious crime. But when Lowell Levine, who was a world famous, he had also testified in the Ted Bundy case, got on the witness stand and gave this mesmerizing testimony, he began to doubt his own brother's guilt. And that was really just really dramatic thing to hear from him on that day, because that's the power of junk science to convict the innocent. And so I started this, and the first chapter in this part one, when I decided to write this book, I really wanted to get deep into where this came from. Where did junk science actually come, and why is it being used in court, and why can't we get rid of it? And so when you trace back to the beginning of bite marks, this isn't really what you asked, but we had talked about the rise of junk science, and that is that what was going on was that forensic dentists, right? So many of you have probably heard about bodies being identified by their dental records, right? Somebody's burned beyond recognition and they're identified by their dental records. What you probably don't know is that's your friendly neighborhood forensic dentist. He works down at the medical examiner's office and they perform this task, right? Is that they identify people. So if you've got, Jane Doe's been discovered, whereas Jane Doe's been missing for a long time. Jane Doe has a gold filling in their fifth molar, voila, it's Jane Doe. So it's basically valid. And they were doing this work in conjunction and next to forensic pathologists. And the forensic pathologists were becoming stars. They were becoming expert witnesses. With this burgeoning industry in the 60s and 70s, people were becoming professional experts. That was all that they did. And that had never happened before. So it became a career that you could aspire to. Quincy. It was a very popular show at the time, exactly. And so, but the dentists were being left out. Right, and they wanted to be, in court. They wanted to be solving crimes, and a lot of forensic experts, have a mindset more of crime solvers than scientists. And they started pointing to bite marks as something that they might use to make identifications, and that they would help solve crimes. And so they conflated these two subdisciplines of forensic dentistry and to get into court. So they used this valid technique of identifying bodies. They invented their own board certifying entity called the American Board of Forensic Odontology. So forensic odontology is a fancy word for a dentist that does forensics. And then they joined the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. But they got all of these credentials. They sounded incredible because they were doing this work. And then when they went into court on their first case, they had a perfect case. Two of them were lawyers as well as dentists, so they understood the value of precedent. This judge looked at this plainly guilty defendant, as far as I could see, and said, well, this isn't scientific evidence. I am recognizing that there's no research here, that there's never been any research here, but this is so elemental that I'm not even going to subject to real scrutiny, because the jury is going to be able to tell with their own eyes whether there's a match or not. And therefore admitted this. And that case became the germinal case. It spread like a virus around the country, and it was used to introduce the evidence in Ted Bundy's case, and it's still being used today, this case. And it also opened the door to all these other forensic techniques that are pattern matching techniques. So you think about fingerprint and shoe wear and all these other, the same reasoning's been applied and allowed it all in.
And, to give a little background here, one can imagine the work of... Is it on now? Is this on? I don't know if I can get some help on this. Is this... Yep. There you go. Thank you. You can imagine the work of dental identification to being, you have someone's hand or their finger, and you have their fingerprint record. You can check to see if that finger matches the fingerprint. That is identifying from teeth marks. A crime identification is all you have is a print, but the print is bent, partial, it's on sponge, it's on skin, and you're going to try and match that print that's, this partial smudged print that's left on a piece of glass or a flesh, in the case of a bite mark, to someone's teeth. What's the error rate of that, right? And it took decades for people to do elemental work that said, you know what, skin and flesh decomposes by the hour, and there is no proof that skin and flesh is a reliable recorder of bite marks. So it took decades to get to that. In fact, I think you might have told me that one of the ironies is one of the landmark court opinions enshrining the admissibility of bite mark evidence turned out to be itself a wrongful conviction. So you talk about the science, it's come to the legal arena. How did the U.S. criminal justice system respond? What does junk science have to do with mass incarceration?
Well, I think that the easiest way to understand the role that junk science plays in mass incarceration is look at kind of the entire legal system and the efforts that have been made over the years to bring more reliability into expert witness testimony. And during this buildup that I was talking about of the legal system in our country during the 70s and 80s, it was really propelled by two forces. I talk a little bit about this in the book. In personal injury litigation, product liability, and tort liability, and mass tort liability litigation on the civil side, exponentially grew our legal system. That was not something that was a common, in the earlier part of the 20th century. And on the criminal side, mass incarceration, and driven largely by the drug war and a lot of other, lesser policies that ended up exploding the criminal justice system side of our legal system. And on the civil side, there had been a lot of corporations that were getting sued on speculative opinions that was being passed off as scientific evidence. A lot of it was righteous litigation too, right? Ford Pintos got taken off the street, for example, a good example. But then something like silicone breast implants that seemed carcinogenic and that probably were not. And so a lot of that type of testimony was being admitted without any scrutiny by the courts. They were just deferring to the experts and saying, we're just going to let this in. So corporations had gotten really tired of it and had decided to tee up a case to get it to the Supreme Court and see if they could get a decision that required more rigor in terms of the way that judges were evaluating scientific evidence. And it worked. They got this case called Daubert. It looks like it should be Daubert, but I know people who know the Dauberts, and that's the way they pronounce their name. And it showed in my boss and one of the co-founders of the Innocence Project, Peter Neufeld, did a study about 10 years after Daubert, and what it showed was that while it had been effective or reasonably effective at excluding a lot of unreliable evidence on the civil side, nothing had changed in the criminal arena at all, even though there have been known wrongful convictions attributable to junk science. So then if you think about why that is, right? And this is the theme that I kind of explore in the book is poor people science, right? And that is the science that is being used. And the reason is that because the people that are subjected to junk science are marginalized communities, largely black and brown, and we don't care about the science that is used to gain those convictions. There's empirical evidence of this. This is not me speculating, right? I did a follow-up study with Brandon Garrett in 2018 that showed that nothing had changed despite nearly half of all wrongful convictions are attributable, at least in part, to unreliable forensic evidence being used in those, and there's still no effort to reform. So the only conclusion that can be drawn to finally answer your question is that junk science is just another tool of the central problems with our criminal legal system, which is structural racism and mass incarceration. And this is a tool that they're unwilling to take out of prosecutors' hands, and the evidence is, legion in the book, and I try to document some of that.
And I think one explanation that I've heard is that these pattern matching techniques, fingerprinting, hair analysis, were talked about since Sherlock Holmes' time, and became popularized, over the years. Hair, certainly by the 50s. The FBI lab was struck by the fingerprinting was the great reform that would help no longer rely on unreliable eyewitness testimony. And hair could be the next best thing to fingerprinting if fingerprints weren't available. So what came to be was that this was science by law enforcement for law enforcement. Unlike DNA, for example, which came out of the medical and scientific arena, was established under rigorous scientific principles, the scientific arena, scientists kind of looked down their noses at forensic science because it was a practitioner's discipline. It was sort of lore handed down generation by generation through expertise and empirical results. And so, hair bite marks, matching fabric, matching rope patterns, tire patterns, all these things you see.
Lip prints.
Yeah.
Ear prints.
Ear prints. All these things you see were developed, and there's not an industry. There's no industry stake. You know, the big money is on the government side, and it's one of these things where you want big science to be in your corner when they're trying to save your life or improve your health or protect your airplanes. In this case, it is in the business of prosecuting, convicting, and jailing people, which again, you know, is a righteous cause. But as we see so often, if there's not transparency or accountability, excesses will happen. And this is a case where a system has been kind of, in our experience, unable to kind of correct itself. And let me just, you know, we talk about the science, we talk about the law. I wanted to ask you about the people. And, you know, is there, you know, does poor people's science also mean racial injustice?
Yeah, I mean, unquestionably, you know, I mean, and the, you know, one of the Spencer mentioned hair microscopy, and one of the really pernicious influences of this technique was the racial categories that were used. They were kind of just adopted in the 50s and never abandoned. And, you know, and just to be clear, hairs that were discovered at crime scenes, right? So what they would do is they would find hairs at crime scene, they would take a hair of a suspect, they would put them under a microscope and see whether the interior microscopically matched, right? So the different characteristics of the interior of hair. And this was thought to be highly probative evidence as to whose hair it was. Sometimes even the person must have been from that person. And there was no statistical database that would make those types of claims possible. They had error rates as high as 10% just on making an association, right? And there had been, even when the FBI finally admitted that this had been a problem, there had already been 70 wrongful convictions attributable at least in part to the use of hair microscopy. And some of them that I document in the book, because the ubiquity of hairs at crime scenes, it was almost always available and it's relatively inexpensive, so it was often used as throw-in evidence. And because so many wrongful convictions involve black people alleged to have perpetrated, you know, some crimes against white people, and this is particularly black men accused of raping white women, when you used hair microscopy, it had the added pernicious influence of racial bias because they would call it a negroid hair, right? And so they would talk about the negroid hair being found in the white woman's pubic combings and playing on the same racist tropes that have led to lynchings and wrongful convictions for the last 400 years, and under the guise of scientific jargon that is still used today. And, you know, and a great example of one of the worst offenses of this is Mark Reed's case in Connecticut. The Connecticut Supreme Court took up the appeal of this conviction. And Mark Reed was a black man, and he was accused by a white woman of rape, and the only physical evidence they had was hair microscopy. And the expert got on the witness stand and he matched these two hairs together and said that this negroid hair had been found in this woman's pubic combings. Now, he complained about the validity of this testimony in the Connecticut Supreme Court, and the Connecticut Supreme Court pointed back to the reasoning of the original bite mark case to say, well, this is such simple stuff, right, that we don't even really need to, it's not required to meet the standards of scientific evidence that would typically be required for something more whiz-bangy, right? And so they affirmed his conviction. 10 years later, when they finally did DNA testing on it, not only was it not Mark Reed's hair, it was the white victim's own hair, right? So that's how bad it was, right? And it's still today, you could get away with going into court and getting microscopic hair comparison admitted as evidence, because every technique that I talk about in the book, every single one of them, is still admissible today in all 50 states. And who is it used against? Overwhelmingly black, brown, poor people.
And I also, to go to a lighter subject, if that's the right way to talk about it, I read in your book you were once called an asswipe under oath. Would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, I was also Mr. Asswipe. He clarified that. He's like, so no, one of, you know, when we started the strategic litigation department was, the idea is and was that we're going to litigate against the leading contributing factors to wrongful conviction. And so eyewitness misidentification is a leading factor, but Right behind that is the misapplication of forensic sciences. And so we were having a debate as to whether or not we were going to, what kind of forensics were we going to go after, right? And ultimately decided that it was going to be bite marks. And so much of the research that went into the book that's devoted to bite marks is me learning, everything that I could possibly learn about bite mark evidence, because I was not familiar with it before we decided to try to get it eliminated, because it was the worst offender. It was the lowest hanging fruit, the junkiest of the junk. Nothing can be said about bite marks. It's total garbage. And I know this is being recorded, so you can quote me on it. But it's like most of the forensic dentists that got into this work, and most forensic experts, are well-meaning, well-intentioned civil servants. Many of them are very, very smart, and that you're taught by, as Spencer was talking about, the feet of the master, and the received wisdom, and the culture doesn't really allow for challenging the received wisdom in these kind of guild structures where the work is that you get, you're required to have a mentor to get into the field, to get casework, to get publishing opportunities. So it creates these kind of bubbles that don't have outside scrutiny from the scientific environment, like the mainstream scientific community. So all the dentists are not bad people, and they didn't go into court trying to frame innocent people. That happened, but that was not the intent. With notable exceptions, including the man who called me an asswipe under oath, right, is Michael West. So Michael West, if any of you saw the Innocence Files, maybe are familiar with this person, but when I started at the Innocence Project in 2012, he had already been totally discredited. There have been 2 terrible wrongful convictions, 2 death penalty cases in Mississippi. And Michael West was, in the 90s, this ascendant forensic celebrity. He's from Mississippi. He had this great old school charm and wit, and he was plain spoken, but he would mix in a lot of scientific jargon. And he was a very, very compelling figure. He was on the Phil Donahue Show. He was in Vanity Fair. He was becoming, a big celebrity. And then he had these wrongful convictions, and then he became slowly more and more discredited and became a little bit more unhinged as we went forward. And so this case, that one of the 3 that I focus on primarily in the book, is Eddie Lee Howard. And in Eddie Lee Howard's case, and this is really just the power of even the idea of junk science, because Michael West got on the witness stand in that case and testified that he had found 3 bite marks on this victim's body, and he matched all 3 of them to Eddie Lee Howard, to exclusion of everybody else. And he gave that testimony without photographs, without documentation, with no actual evidence. It's just him sitting on the witness stand with an aw shucks, I matched some bite marks to him, and he got sent to death row twice in Parchman Prison Farm in Mississippi. So I was brought into the case because I was becoming an expert in bite mark evidence, but the truth is that we didn't even know what it was. We had to treat it like a normal case. And so we decided that we're going to depose Michael West in advance of this hearing that we're going to do, and it was left to me to do the deposition. I was terrified because this person was so notorious and was really going to be saying anything, and it's a death penalty case, right? And so we drove down. I write about this scene. It was also reported in Spencer's newspaper at one point that I did a deposition in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, with and I didn't know this actually in the moment, but when I was researching the book, I found out that the lawyer whose firm we were doing the deposition in used to be the district attorney in Hattiesburg, and he was the first one that got Michael West qualified as a bite mark expert. So a lot of damage was done as a result of that. And so we got into the parking lot. Like walking in the parking lot, and I saw Michael West drive up in a sedan, and it was like seeing Snuffleupagus. I was terrified of this guy. And he's sitting in his sedan, and my co-counsel Tucker Carrington starts to walk over because he's Southern. These guys are always nice to each other, even when they hate each other. But so he's gonna go be polite and say hello. And West is at his door, and you can see the electric window. He's smoking cigarettes, and he just starts rolling out the window without even looking at him, and the car starts filling with smoke. He totally ignored us. And then we got into this deposition, and it went off the rails very, very quickly. And it was hours of, really one of the most intense, bizarre experiences I've had as a lawyer. And what happened is, like, first we're going to talk a little bit about real bite marks, then we're going to talk about his colleagues, you know, and then finally I'm just going to start accusing him of fraud because that was all that's left. And the only line I think that he prepped the entire time was when I accused him of fraud. He said, you know, I'm not the one named Fabricant. You are.
And you know, what the book shows over and over again is this human drama. It's the role of a prosecutor who's been in place for 45 years. It's the role of this pioneering, dentist or examiner whose influence then intimidate and cows everyone else so that they change their judgments to support his judgment, which was that's how you got 6 people to agree, because the great leader had established the Harward case. You have scenes where a prosecutor breaks down in tears, when finally kind of confronted with the reality of an error, and the defendant sitting next to him. And to throw in another example, just so people get a sense of the flavor, the number of arsons in the United States between 1980 and 2010 fell by a half. And one part of it is, human behavior. People started fewer fires. But another part of it was the U.S. government, the Commerce Department, National Institutes of Standard and Technology, because of the dollar value involved, conducted test burnings of houses. And what they discovered, because of also questions in criminal cases, they discovered that many of the telltale signs that for decades fire examiners, investigators, had used as proof of arson, like V-shaped flame patterns, crazed glass, which they took to be signs of the use of accelerant and the rapid heating, occurred from things like when a window broke and there was a sudden onrush of air, what they call flame over, flash over. When you spray a water hose against a glass, hot glass, it fractures. So they discovered many of the things they've been attributing to arson occurred in every fire. And I guess in the area of hair, again, these were people trying their best to apply, their expertise over time. They knew the evidence was good. They knew it was worth something. A match was worth something. How often do the hairs of two different people might the hairs of two different people appear to be the same? There is no scientific research to answer that question. There's no answer to what's the error rate. How often might we be wrong? Instead of just acknowledging that, which is a fact that was known since 1974, that two different people might disagree because it's so subjective about a particular hair. They knew since the 80s you could not use it for identification like you could for fingerprints. But for 30 years, under testimony, they would instead substitute, well, based on my personal experience, I've done 4,000 examinations. I've never seen, the hair of two different people to look alike. Or, gee, if I've only seen it 1 in 10,000 times and there's two different people that are matching, that must be 1 in a 10,000 and 10,000, 1 in a million. These were entered into testimony from a FBI expert with the imprimatur of science, when in fact the answer is we don't know. In this hair examination that we talked about, in 2015, the FBI and Justice Department formally acknowledged that nearly every examiner in that elite FBI lab hair unit gave flawed testimony in almost all trials in which they offered evidence against criminal defendants over more than 2 decades, before 2000. That's 26 out of 28 examiners gave testimony improperly favoring prosecutors in more than 95% of 270 trials. And this was a sample out of 2,500 hair matches. This is not to say that there wasn't other evidence of guilt. Hair evidence, though, like we said, it serves a dramatic purpose, right? CSI serves a dramatic purpose. You can hear all the testimony and witness testimony and so on, but when somebody says the murderer rapist left a part of themselves at the crime scene, it seals the deal. Again, that group included 32 defendants sentenced to death and 14 who eventually died in prison or were executed. Talk about what's being done. What's the, and what can be done, and what can ordinary people do?
You know, what's astonishing to me, is that we don't have something like the FDA that is policing forensics, right? With toothpaste, with aspirin, with any other kind of consumer products, that these are tested, scientifically tested and demonstrated to be safe before it's unleashed on the public for public consumption, right? For public health reasons, right? And that there's nothing similar like that in forensics, and there's nothing standing between a junk science death sentence and the use of that testimony to put somebody to death. The only thing is a judge. And a judge is not going to consult the scientific literature to decide what's valid and what's not. Judges are going to look at case law, right? And case law doesn't advance. Case law very, very, incrementally, and not the way that science does, right? Science is a process that is always moving forward. And we're always abandoning previously claimed abilities or techniques when those hypotheses have been shown to be false or they're modified with new knowledge. That's not the way that the law works. The law is established precedent and predictable outcomes. So what the judge is going to do is going to look up in Westlaw and he's going to say, oh wait, Ted Bundy was convicted on bite marks, right? And this has been and you get this in all these opinions. Bite marks have been admissible evidence for 50 years, and that should be evidence actually that it's time to take another look, because science changes over the course of 50 years, but that's not the way it's presented in criminal trials. So what we need, and what the Innocence Project has advocated for a long time, is something like the National Institute of Standards and Technology to do the validation research separate from the adversarial process of the criminal justice system. Now, there's no reason that evidence shouldn't be tested, demonstrated reliable, and there's no reason that it's not. The only reason, I can't think of a reason why it's not being done other than the fact that we don't really care, that we don't really want to, because the resources are there and we can see the impact that junk science has had on innocent people. I talk about at least 5, what I argue are wrongful executions, and that are all attributable, at least in part, to the use of unreliable, so-called scientific evidence in these cases. Now that should be enough. One of them was Cameron Todd Willingham, and you were talking about arson. This is total folklore, right? That they did one experiment, one that I talk about also in the book, that disproved or falsified virtually all of the folklore that had been used for 50 years, right? And this is the reason that all of these, they don't have like half the number of arsons, is because people aren't going in and using this folklore anymore, and they're not calling it an intentional fire. But at least one person has been put to death, and probably more than one, on something that was just, what I call, and I should be clear about what I mean when I say junk science. Like what I call it, or what I defined it as in the book, is subjective speculation masquerading as scientific evidence, but it doesn't have any empirical basis for that opinion, right? That hasn't been scientifically validated in a crime lab, because most of these techniques are emerged from crime scenes. Like they painted a bullseye around a target, right? And so they don't emerge, as Spencer was talking about, from a crime lab, right? They're techniques that are out there, and then they'll be useful to solve a particular crime, and it kind of gets in the drinking water or gets in the jurisprudence. And the judges are making decisions not about the systemic impact of the entire justice system. They're looking at, like, the way that everybody else is looking at in the courtroom, except for maybe the defendant and the defense attorney, is that this person is probably guilty, and that I'm not going to take a tool out of the prosecutor's hand that's going to help convict a guilty person. So we need something to test these claims that are being made in court outside of the adversarial system, right? One of the main recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences 2009 report on forensic sciences, which is a devastating document that I also explore a little in the book, that found only DNA evidence of all the techniques that are being used every day. Only DNA evidence was capable of identifying the suspect or the source of crime scene evidence. And yet, still today, you can go into any court in the country and they're claiming this in firearms, that only that gun could have fired that bullet to the exclusion of every other gun in the history of time. That's still acceptable, right? So what we can do is we can have a forensic entity that's controlled outside of the government. And what I meant to say about the 2009 report's recommendation was to separate crime labs from law enforcement, right? Is that if you have a crime lab or a laboratory that's perceived to be just an arm of law enforcement and that their job is to bust bad guys, you're going to get biased results because there's subjectivity in forensics. All forensics have levels of subjectivity, including DNA, some much more than others. And what we can do as people is be skeptical, right? Be skeptical jurors, serve on juries, and don't accept anybody in a white lab coat as, as therefore infallible opinions, because we know that that's not true.
I guess we would welcome any questions. And if you have any, I guess while you think of some or line up, we would just say that, that FBI hair review was done in conjunction with the Innocence Project and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. It helped prompt the Obama administration to create a National Forensic Science Commission, which attempted to set uniform standards for testimony, to promote and identify necessary research. It also went about and proposed conducting similar reviews for all these kind of question techniques. Unfortunately, it only had 2 years, and the Trump administration, which took office, shelved it. But these are active areas where, perhaps some of you in this room have worked on these issues. And again, this is not just an issue of it's a matter of justice for people who are wrongfully convicted. It's also an issue that prosecutors care about because it's their work, that crime victims care about because they want to bring the right person to justice. And the argument that the Justice Department advanced in doing this was that its role is not just to prosecute the guilty, it's also to minister justice fairly, and also to be sort of the patron and leader of forensic science research. The FBI lab, which took on this undertaking, is prides itself and is the gold standard. It is the agency that has kind of pioneered and led the use of these techniques and to improving these techniques and trying to set a national standard.
I should add that it was Spencer's reporting that helped spur that, and I write about it a little bit in the book, is that, I said earlier that there had been at least 70 wrongful convictions attributable to hair comparison evidence, at least in part, before that audit occurred. And the reason that that audit occurred was largely due to Spencer reporting on 3 kind of back-to-back-to-back wrongful convictions here in D.C. There was 3 black men, all accused of victimizing white women, all convicted on hair microscopy testimony, and that testimony in each one of those 3 cases was very, very important to the case. It wasn't throw-in evidence. It was 3 different experts, all from the FBI crime lab, so they couldn't use the bad apple argument. But they still were not going to recall this. They weren't going to do a recall on all this hair evidence until they got pressure from the Washington Post through Spencer to actually do something. And it was my first couple of weeks at the Innocence Project. It was astonishing to me because I remember as a baby public defender taking pleas on hair comparison cases, right? I didn't know enough to challenge it, right? It's like, so I had a little soul searching to do myself.
And there was a D.C. federal public defender, Sandra Levick, had all those 3 cases. 3 men, 75 years, spent a combined 75 years in prison for rapes and murders, that they were DNA exonerations. Someone else committed those crimes. Each one was testimony where, 1 in 10,000 chance the hair match was wrong. But
Questions?
Hi. Is this on? Okay. Is there a hierarchy of science, of junk science? Is it all junk all the way, or is some less bad than others?
I should be very clear. No, not all forensics are junk. Certainly
No,
not.
I don't mean all forensics, but
Right.
the ones that you might classify junk science, is some more acceptable, so to speak, than others?
Yeah, and you can take an otherwise valid technique and make it very junky depending on the quality of the evidence or the application in a particular case, right? So, fingerprints comes up a couple times in the book. And fingerprints, and I, personally believe are probably unique. That's not a scientifically validated fact. They probably are, and they've been successfully used to identify people for, hundreds of years. But what we don't know is how similar 2 prints are. And when we're talking about forensics, we're not talking about deliberately rolled prints. We're talking about smudges at crime scenes. And we don't know how much information you need to make a reliable match, because we don't know if you have too little information, how many other people might also match that, because you don't have the whole print. So you can take something that is valid and reliable, fingerprint generally are, and make it into a problematic technique, just on its application. So in spectrum-wise, certainly bite marks are the lowest, the junkiest of what we've had, except for kind of random one-offs that you have, or cadaver dog evidence, which we could talk about, but it's also pretty junky. So there really is a spectrum, and what's also kind of problematic, and this relates to the fingerprint example again, is that there are no efforts, almost no efforts in forensics to shield biasing information from forensic experts. So we have subjectivity, and whenever you have subjectivity, you have bias. And one of the most famous research studies was done by Dr. E.T.L. Juries in the aftermath of a very high-profile wrongful arrest on fingerprint match. And what Dr. Juries did is that he took evidence from casework, right? So latent prints and exemplars. And he sent them to 5 different forensic experts or fingerprint experts that had decades of experience. They were board certified, they were everything, right? And what he didn't tell them, though, was that it was evidence from their own prior cases. They had already come to conclusions on these different samples. And the only thing they had changed was the contextual information that they were provided. So like that there was a confession, or that there was an eyewitness, or whatever. And 3/5 of them changed their original conclusions from just based on the contextual information. Nothing had changed about the fingerprints, right? So the power of bias, and this is one of the problems we have with separation of crime labs from law enforcement for these reasons. So you can turn something, to get back to your question, into something junky, just by its application, or failing to be rigorous about blinding experts from irrelevant information. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
Quick question. Other than being called an asswipe, what is the most common rebuttal that you hear from this universe of forensic dentists to your assertion that their work is junk science? And has there been any sort of thing that they have said during the course of your career that's giving you pause in your confidence of your assertion that it's junk science?
I must sound pretty confident that it's junk science, but the common rebuttal that I get is that you never talk about the ones that we got right. And it's just like, yeah, because we don't talk about the planes that landed safely in the airport either, right? We talk about the crashes. So we hear about that, and then a lot of will be efforts to say that, okay, yeah, we can't make an identification, but we can exclude somebody, right? So, and then they'll give you an example like, say somebody has no teeth, right? And then this person does. So we could exclude the guy with no teeth. You'll give something like that. Then you go back to this notion that you can identify what is and what is not a bite mark to begin with. And there's a devastating study in 2016 that was done by the bite mark experts themselves, thinking that they were going to start validating their field. And they asked 40 different of these board certified experts. Remember, they don't get tested on their abilities to become board certified. So always check, the fine print on a board certification. It's often nonsense. And they asked them to come to conclusions. Is this a bite mark, not a bite mark, or inconclusive? And they were all over the place, right? So it was like flipping a coin, So when you don't know ground truth, you have to have, what's known as inter-rater reliability. So people with similar levels of expertise are looking at the same evidence. You should come to, relatively consistent findings, and they don't. So that's the refrain. But yeah, bite marks, you really can't say anything for them. It's like,
Eric, your colleague Eric Tucker here, a great reporter with the Associated Press. I was going to say, there's that old adage that better let 10 guilty men go free than convict one innocent person. And so the traditional understanding has been, wrongful convictions are extraordinarily rare, like a fraction of 1%. And that's been the great, this is a, fast changing, everybody, overworked, under-resourced, doing critical work to protect the public, which is all true. But then they do DNA research and they find that, 11% of the time of our matches were wrong. but then they don't follow that up. They don't say, did we do the testimony wrong? And what it shows is like, well, you could have prevented these mistakes if you had just simple things like monitoring what people testified to, which the FBI didn't do. You could do things like do proficiency examinations, because these exams were so subjective, and they didn't take notes, and so all that was said was it was a human head hair, it was color black from African origin, and that stood up in testimony. You have to create real scientific criteria, benchmark criteria. How many times how many factors does it take to make a match? And other things like, again, relatively simple things like don't do a lineup. Well, if you're going to do eyewitness identification, it turns out that there's even higher, the good news about these forensic techniques is that there's an even higher rate with eyewitness misidentifications. So one of the things you can try and do is do blinded administration. So you have somebody not involved with the investigation do a photo array, and you don't line everybody up, so you don't have like 5 people without a mustache and 1 person with a mustache, and that mustache person being the subject because it was what the victim said. So there are easy ways to reduce cognitive bias, and you might remember this case. Chris was talking about publicity and the role of the media, and as the great screenwriters of The Simpsons said, alcohol is both the cause of and solution to so many of life's problems. Publicity is also the cause of and solution to so many of these issues. When the FBI Crime Lab's greatest modern scandal was in the 90s, and a whistleblower came forward, Inspector General did a report, found that 13 examiners overstated, exaggerated stuff in some of the highest profile cases. The O.J. Simpson murder case, 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1995 Oklahoma City federal building bombing. They found that people were human. They were pressured to find the criminal and make a match. In those cases, the IG found that there was no perjury and that there was no material impact. There was other evidence of guilt. And there was even an erroneous fingerprint match by the FBI, which they had thought could never happen. It was in the Madrid Atocha train bombing, the terrorist train bombing in 2004. Bag of detonators was left where 400 people were killed. There was a grocery bag with a bag of detonators, fingerprints. FBI found it matched an immigration lawyer who recently in Portland, Oregon, who had recently converted to Islam. The Spanish authorities said, we aren't that sure. Are you guys really sure? And the FBI doubled down and said, we're absolutely sure. We had 3 people confirm it, 3 of our best examiners. The Spanish said, well, we actually got a guy in custody whose prints match. He's from Morocco, across the Gibraltar Straits, and he was, he's a member of a known terrorist group, and he was associated with this group, where we recovered this other stuff. In other words, you got the wrong guy. And again, what this shows is that even with the soundest techniques, it's just a matter of cognitive bias, human pressure, the publicity. These techniques work. It's that, or these techniques produce good evidence. The problem comes with human nature, which is if you don't monitor what people are saying when they're under pressure, and if you don't have research standards, accreditation, and expectations that you have scientists doing this. One of the issues was that all those people doing those FBI hair exams were agents, not civilian scientific examiners. One of the reforms that's since been undertaken.
Hi.
I had a question, but I think I changed it.
Okay.
I was curious, in a criminal justice system so demonstrably targeted towards specific groups and communities of people, are there any forensic evidence that are immune to malicious actors, whether consciously or unconsciously malicious, in your opinion?
I mean, I don't think that there's any real form of forensics, since we abandoned phrenology, that is like kind of explicitly racist. It's really just serving, what I argue is, mass incarceration is a form of structural racism, and so this is service to this larger beast. But apart from like these kind of racial categories, which should have just been changed, like to reflect, that this is a racist terminology, but I'm trying to think if there are other, there's future a lot of death penalty litigation, a lot of social sciences that are talking about future dangerousness and that kind of thing is highly problematic and often trained against black people. So there are, but so to answer your question, not really, I would say, is like, but, you could probably find some examples. I don't want to just rattle off too many because I want to be clear about, that aspect of it, but it's an interesting question. But I think it's really largely a product of a symptom of a much larger disease.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's it.
Again, just a remarkable book. Congratulations, Chris.
Thank you, Spencer.
You cover again 5 decades of work, so many different cases, and just a beautiful, wrenching, hard to read and impossible to put down book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you so much.